cup of something warm to drink. And we've just started our live stream. So hello to everyone on the live stream as well as in our Zoom webinar. Welcome. And especially to Michael, who's interrupted his cruise to join us today. So thank you, Michael. Lovely to see you.
Can you hear the fire burning at my house?
My job after this call, go and light the wood burner in the sitting room so I can possibly settle down later.
Yeah, it's been cold here this weekend.
We've got snow coming at the weekend and already booked into a pub in the Brecon Beacons.
Good.
Okay, so we are at past. Should we give it one more minute to allow the next few people to come in?
Sure.
Welcome to everyone joining us.
Better remind people we're switching off the comments for a period, I think.
Yeah, I'll do that, don't you, Marie?
I brought some poems.
Beautiful.
I've got a bookshelf full of them through there, including some in Welsh if we really need them. But actually, I think for complexity, you can't beat Robert Frost.
Yeah, Robert Frost is beautiful.
Welcome everyone coming in. We're just going to give it another minute or so before we make a start. Hello to everyone on our live stream this evening as well.
Been locked in on the Tan Hill Inn several times, all right, in response to that question. It's also where I made the mistake once of drinking 3 pints of Old Peculiar and then trying to cycle down a steep hill afterwards. But that's another story.
Okay, what do you think? Should we make a start? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Well, in which case, I would like to begin just by extending a very, very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today from across the world. We are so happy that you could make it this evening to a clearly much anticipated conversation between Nora Bateson and Dave Snowden on when meaning loses its meaning. So before I pass over to Nora to start things off, I would just like to let you all know a bit of housekeeping. We're going to be keeping the chat function on for the next 10 minutes. It's amazing to see you all introducing yourselves and letting us know where you're joining us from. Then we'll turn this off to let you all really just settle into the conversation. The Q&A function will be open throughout, so please do use this to engage and ask questions. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So without further ado, I would love to pass over to you, Nora, just to frame things for us today. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything, Ellie, about questions afterward and what we're doing with that?
Yes, thank you, Nora. So if we don't manage to address all of the questions that come through on the Q&A today, which I'm sure will be the case because there's just so many of you, we're going to be using these to help guide future conversations. So thank you all so much for contributing to this space. Cool. Thank you, Nora.
Great. I just want everyone to know that you do have a voice and it matters to us. And we are also under the pressure of the clock to address a rather large subject. So let's begin. I have the dubious task of framing this, which is a lot of fun and also sort of a quandary. And when we were thinking of what we would talk about, this rather pithy phrase of meaning losing meaning came up. And it came up for a whole lot of reasons. I hope that we touch a fraction of them tonight. But one of them has to do with, I think, a shared sense that Dave and I have of a loss of some of the necessary blur that is needed when thinking about living systems. And I guess where my own history and work comes in is in this exploration of living systems and how the responsiveness and processes of continuing life, which is also discontinuing other things. Life needs to both continue and discontinue in order to continue. So what's happening there? What's in this multi-deterministic relational process that is a meadow, that is the body, that is a forest, that is a society, that is an animal? And how can we best be students of that, so that the way that we respond to it is less destructive? Now, it's funny because I have a tagline similar to that on my, I don't know, some one of my many bios. And you know what? Dave has almost the identical tagline on his. So I've always thought that was kind of an interesting coincidence, because it isn't really a coincidence. I think for me, the frustrations that I have felt and the eagerness that I have to contribute to this conversation are around how to support and to celebrate this blur. And when I say blur, what I mean is that life is not like a wristwatch. And it's not necessarily controllable or manageable or predictable in the ways that more mechanistic processes are. I think you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't already know that. And yet, the habituated cultural and expected responsiveness to any kind of complex problem, like you name one, from your family issues to your health issues to larger global political, environmental issues. These are all complex issues. And when we get to those, it becomes there's a kind of anxiety that kicks in that is producing it's producing a linearity. It's producing a return to that mechanistic thinking. And it is actually a discredit to the process of being able to perceive things that are in motion, things that are changing, relationships that are changing. So in any kind of living system, all the relationships are changing all the time. In order to have a particular kind of attention on that ever-shifting process, there is a need to not be seeking those things that are still and it's possible to ossify. But that's not what happens. In an effort to try to manage and get control, there is this ossification process. So what is meaning? And why are we asking this question? Well, one of the things that both Dave and I work with is abductive process. And it's a way of looking at the way different contexts are giving information and the possibility for hypothesis of other contexts. This is really important. It's really important because the way that we learn or experience anything is in fact produced through the way we have experienced what came before. The way that you learn about love is shifted by the way you learned how to be in nature, by the way you learn how to use money, by the way you learn how to be in your body, by all these other contexts. The way you learn how to think about your identity is informed from context in all directions. The way that we learn to play music is in fact enhanced and enriched from your experience of heartbreak, from your experience of success or dreams, or your relationship to your sexuality. So already, I hope you're feeling a little bit of confusion, right? That the thing that we're trying to grab onto is not there in the way that we're looking for it. And so what is meaning? And what do we mean by meaning? The work on abductive process by Charles Sanders Peirce is probably the basis of this. And then both Dave and I use this work in slightly different ways, but we thought it would be interesting to invite you into a little bit of that theory. Now, abductive process, I work with this all the time in warm data, and this is not something that you learn in 10 minutes because it's confusing. Nothing is where you placed it. But because of that, it actually is really an important perception capacity to try to strengthen. It will allow you to begin to see in more transcontextual ways. I'm gonna open there and see where this goes.
Okay, so this has been an interesting journey over about, I think, 3 years, Nora.
Yeah.
So we first met in Stockholm, and I think it's fair to say both of us were approached the first session with great trepidation, right? And then thoroughly enjoyed ourselves in every subsequent conversation. So we're trying to find something we substantially disagree on, and that may or may not come out in this conversation. A couple of things. First of all, I think this concept of ambiguity is, I would say ambiguity as much as blur, but I think it's the same concept.
Yeah.
Probably one of the phrases I've used a lot from the Bible, which sort of shows my own upbringing, is 1 Corinthians 13:12, which I'm going to quote the King James Version because that's poetry, whereas the other stuff is literal translation, which is not as good. And it's the famous one which says, "We now see as through a glass darkly."
Mm-hmm.
And I love that phrase, yeah, because it doesn't mean that there isn't something that we can discover, but it means we can't fully understand it. And I think that's one of the things that we've lost in organizations over the past 3 or 4 decades. And one of the reasons for that is the dominance of an engineering metaphor, which came in on the back of systems dynamics and various other things around that. And it was an attempt to remove uncertainty. And the irony on this is we all live with uncertainty into our day-to-day lives. Anybody who's got children knows about managing uncertainty, right, in terms of the way you survive. But there's been an attempt to remove it in organizations. And I think that's an issue we share in common, right? I think the thing which relates to that as well is we're also, I think, mutually concerned about the way that complexity theory, any of the theories around living systems, are being trivialized and corrupted, right? And that's increasingly common as it becomes a fashionable item. And I mean, there's well-intentioned stuff there. So somebody asked a question about panicky, for example, in the question line. I've always seen panicky as one particular cycle, but not the only cycle. And I've also seen, and this is going to introduce another theological concept, the idea that you have to have chaos before you can actually have meaning is deeply problematic. Mm-hmm. And that's how a lot of people interpret it. It's why I don't like the forest cycle that a lot of people use when they talk about complexity, because it encourages this attitude that we have to go into complete collapse for some sort of new order to emerge from that. And A, that's never been true, and B, society can't cope with that anymore. We've got to find a way to exit and without that crisis side. And I think there's one of the books I grew up on in my early days was Jürgen Moltmann's work on hope. And I think hope is one of the sort of key concepts. If you come from a Christian background, hope, giving up on hope is actually a mortal sin. Yeah. And Terry Eagleton, who I was famously on an editorial committee with, published a book recently called Hope Without Optimism. And I think that's a really good way of phrasing where we need to be, because I think Nora and I are often being accused of being cynical. It's not that we're without hope, it's just we're not prepared to go along with happy, clappy solutions to something. And I think the word we've used a lot in the context of the discussion is the context of rigour. Yeah, is you have to have a valid base to what you're doing. You can't just suck up something because you love the language and run along with it. Yeah, and you've almost got this dichotomy in business at the moment between hard engineers on one side and what I call new age fluffy bunnies on the other. And it's one of those sort of really false dichotomies in terms of the way we work. So for me, and abduction, I still remember it when I was in Washington, and a lot of our stuff comes from working on counterterrorism, and when I was in IBM. And one of the questions which was posed by a former national security advisor is, he said, what I want you to do is to solve the problem of abduction. Mm-hmm. Right? And I spent 7 years of my life in IBM trying to do that, and we made progress, and I'm still working on it. Now, the way that's defined is, and I'll just give a background on this and hand back to Nora. You've got deduction, induction, abduction. So deduction is if A, then B. Induction is all the cases of A have B. And that's where most people are at the moment. One of the things I get deeply distressed about is the amount of people who actually gather 15 or 16 cases, interpret those cases into a recipe book approach to a solution. It's kind of like all these companies are profitable, therefore if you do these things, you too will be profitable. And there's almost like an industry on that. And it's an industry which produces certification. The latest absurdity I've found is somebody for £1,000 will train you to be a chief happiness officer and give you a badge, right? Now, when that starts to happen, the world has turned into a level of absurdity that we could do without. And it's not against happiness, but it's this idea that you can engineer emergent properties. And for the last 20 or 30 years, that's actually been a strong tendency. We see these things we desire, so we'll try and create them, rather than creating the conditions out of which they can emerge in a context which is appropriate to you. So the induction thing in terms of the cases has become deeply problematic because it assumes causality. Yeah. And you also get this false confusion of correlation with causation. Now, there are some ones I'm prepared to believe, like suicides by drowning directly correlate with Nicolas Cage movies being released for the past century. And I can buy that one. But the sort of false correlations are things like dark chocolate consumption with Nobel Prizes per head of population and the like. And that's where you've got far more data than most people have before they create these industrial recipes. So one of the metaphors I've been building on is the concept we need more chefs and few recipe book users. And chefs understand the principles of taste, that's the rigorous aspect, but they've also practiced their trade. They have, this is what Aristotle calls Sophia and Pronesis. Yeah, and you can't have one without the other. Practical wisdom without theoretical knowledge will never scale. Theoretical knowledge without practice will never actually be applied. So it's that combination of the two. Now in there, I think that's the huge insight of Peirce and the pragmatists and Dewey who came afterwards, which is the recognition that the ability to spot unconnected links between things, which is what abduction is sometimes known as the logic of hunches. So what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things? And it's a human characteristic. We're actually really very good at it. Coming back to the point about poetry, we now know one of the functions of art in human evolution is to allow us to move up a level of abstraction so we can make connections that we wouldn't make if we stayed in the concrete. You know, the downside of that is we're subject to conspiracy theories. And so that was the problem we were given, right? And one of the ways we've been working on that is to look at things from multiple perspectives in real time. And that's where there's been an interest in the area of exploration between warm data and SenseMaker, which is going on at the moment. So that ability to see patterns, and I think the critical thing is the ability to pay attention to outliers. And human beings will not do that. You can't just try and make people more conscious to do that, because actually it's against our evolutionary history. We make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data scans, and you aren't going to stop that. So ways to get people to pay attention to things in the margin, I'll use a phrase here, the margins of meaning, yeah, which is where novelty emerges, is something we're both focused on in different ways. And that's where we're actually going to find out, I hesitate to use the word, but in terms of global warming, that's when we may find the seeds of salvation. It's not in the dominant view, it's in these margins of meaning, yeah, these weak signals, these things on the edge. But in order to be credible there, you have to approach it with rigor. Yeah, you can't go into anything which sounds good should be adopted. You have to say, why does this sound good? What's its basis? Where should you go? So for me, objective approaches to abduction at scale are kind of like key to achieving change in society.
I agree completely. And one of the things that I would like to add to that is that in the way that we work with it in the warm data world, what we're looking at is essentially offering ways to make those connections differently and to make them with more contextual information, more context through the filters and the processes of more contextual experience, right? Every human being has lots of complex experience. Life is complex. You are complex. I am complex. We live in a complex world. We are not in any way unable to do complexity. It's what we do. And I get very frustrated when people think that you have to have a college degree in a particular set of sciences to understand complex systems. That's not true. But the rigour is accessible through any possible door. The rigour is accessible through cooking. It's accessible through mathematics. It's accessible through hiking. It's accessible through all sorts of anything that is allowing you to go deeply into the study of how one aspect of life is connected and is in some way enriching your understanding of other contexts. So there's a slight difference in the way that my dad used abductive process, in that he talked about it more as the way in which one context becomes a description of another through the observer, obviously. And I think that that's an interesting kind of add to what you're talking about with the hunches, because one of the examples that I like to use is the example of the education system. Okay. And we can think, okay, we must fix the education system. We have all sorts of issues in the education system. And go to the schools and try to pump money in, or, provide more iPads or whatever it is, make a new curriculum. But the issue that's going on in the education system, the issues are not necessarily produced or within the education system. They're cultural, they're political, they're economic, they're the expectations of one generation to another. They're historic, they're in technology, they're in science, they're in all these other contexts. And so I think that it's really important to recognize that in this way, this rigour that I think you and I are both really interested in is the rigour of practice. It's the rigour of attention to those relational reflections. One of the kind of the cruxes of abductive process is the possibility of hypothesizing. Okay, so this is where the hunches come in. So you know something in one context, and it gives you the material, it gives you the ideas, it gives you the patterns, it gives you the impressions through which you will then hypothesize that this other experience could be like that too, right? And or this other thing that you're looking at could have that. And so in that you start to see that when we're looking then at that happening in multiple contexts through multiple lenses simultaneously, okay, it's not like we have to do this just one at a time, one context at a time. When you hear a piece of music, you're hearing it through the experience of your life. And if your life changes, you hear the music differently.
And I think music changes the way you see things. I mean, sorry, this is as a confirmed opera buff from when my mother went to university in Germany in the 40s, all right? Is if I want to write something deadly serious, it's Wagner. If I want to write something light on the blog, it's Verdi, and so on. So the ability to create, and it's I know the science of that now, it's a form of cognitive activation. It recognizes certain patterns and repeats. And it's a way of what we can call managed habituation, which I think is interesting because people do become habituated. Yeah. And if we can manage habituation, it's what happens with ritual when people go into an operating theatre and they scrub up. It's not just that they're getting clean, but they're also becoming a doctor or a surgeon or an operating nurse. It's an activation pattern of change. And I think we've lost rituals in our societies and in education. Yeah. So two things on this. One is, one of the things we're looking at is what I want to call micro entanglements. So this is from a wonderful definition of complexity by Alicia Gerraro, whose books are wonderful. She's got a new one coming out. And she famously said a complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. Yeah, which is a small woodland for those who don't speak English first language, right? And that's a wonderful image. So what we started to look at is if you can actually capture people's narratives on extended timelines, if we can entangle those timelines, people will see at points of coherence, a concept we're developing, entanglements with different ways of thinking. So there was nothing I would like more than to entangle the current British Home Secretary, who is, sorry about this, is the closest to evil I've seen in a politician in years, to entangle her life journey with the life journey of some of the refugees who she's condemning to distress, so that they can see points of empathy in that entanglement. That's one of the big things we're looking at the moment. So I can entangle my timeline, and time is an ambiguous concept, with other people, and I can discover patterns in that entanglement which make me see the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm calling empathetic entanglement, which is, I got really irritated with somebody doing chick bait on empathy as manipulation. I want everybody to join my compassion club, right? And that sort of thing we could do without, right? I think then two other things. One is, I would say praxis, not practice.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I'm a child of the 70s. We used to say praxis makes perfect, right? You need the rigor of theory as well as the rigor of practice. But all good theory is available to anybody intelligent enough to read books. Yeah, you can check that stuff. The trouble is, one of the things we got on this, what we can call the airport book stand, is people grab one idea, trivialize it, throw lots of cases, put it out and create a recipe, then repeat every 2 to 3 years. So we're losing generalists. And I think that also impacts on the education system. And you mentioned iPad. I think this is a major issue, right? So we know from a whole body of research that constant interaction with screens is, in epigenetic terms, going to activate autism genes. Yeah, you need broader experience than we're currently getting. We ran a physical masterclass the other day in Reading. It's a completely different teaching experience from Zoom, because you've got more signals coming in. And I remember when I was at school, the headmaster did two things. First of all, he made us all do RSA stage 3 typing. Now, you need to understand that in 1972, if you were in the academic sixth, you were one of the 5% of the population which was going to university. And typing was something done by people who couldn't even make the grammar school and were going to get jobs as secretaries. So we thought this was humiliating. But it was the best skill I've ever got, because it was a pragmatic skill. The other thing he did, which was wrong, was to actually teach us how to use punch card machines, because we'd have a job for life. And in modern schools, teaching kids computer programming is the equivalent of that, because anything we teach them is going to be out of date by the time they leave college. And they're not being taught about ethics. They're not being taught about human interaction. They're not being taught about they're not encountering things in a broad enough space. And I wrote a paper recently for ITEL, which said no software engineer should be allowed out without a basic training in ethics, because everything they're writing at the moment has massive ethical implications, but they haven't got the cognitive sets to deal with it. So I think we need to start to think, and this is what we need to start to breed a generation of generalists. Yeah, because at the moment, for the last 20 or 30 years, everybody is being hyper-specialized. Yeah, which is good for industry because it makes them sort of commodities in boxes.
Compartmentalization is critical.
Yeah, and the psychometric equivalent is nonsense like Myers-Briggs or our mutual hatred for step changes theories of maturity, all right? So these are all about making people widgets in a manufacturing process. And the educational system, for example, in England now and Australia, is actually creating punitive fees for the humanities and low fees for the STEM subjects. And all of that is about creating an elite. So only if your family are rich can you study the humanities, into the ruling class. Everybody else is being moved into a sort of mechanical process. So I think there are small changes we can make in education, and there's small changes we can make in human interaction. But we need people who are, meaning comes from curiosity. And we're creating whole generations who aren't curious. They just want to be told what to do and follow a recipe or go through a structure. Yeah.
And I think, Dave, that has to do with the premises. It has to do with this idea of getting something that is useful that I can apply. Mm. Okay. And this is, I mean, there's nothing wrong with getting something that's useful that you can apply, but it's about what you're looking for. Right. And if you're looking for a recipe, what will happen is you'll get one. And if you're looking for enough sort of experience and savvy and exploration in the kitchen that when there's nothing there, you can somehow produce a meal. That's another thing. It's a completely different kind of preparation, because, and I think that's really important. And it's the premises, it's the basis upon which we move through life.
And I think it's also that if you over-focus on what you get out of this, I mean, Max Basser, who was my mentor, and if anybody hasn't read his books, they should. He was one of the great guys, a true generalist, yeah? And he once did a little research project and identified something like 60% of the British economy came from pure science in the 40s and 50s, which everybody thought was useless at the time. And having studied philosophy and theoretical physics, I feel I need to justify both of them, right? So it's this, I mean, I was reading a wonderful new book on the Burgundians just before I came on this. I took a half an hour off. And curiosity about history is, very few people read books on history these days. Very few people read outside the subject area. In fact, to be honest, very few people read, right? And that sort of transdisciplinary, which is a genuine curiosity about disciplines, is one of the ways that you actually achieve abduction, because abduction is the ability to connect unconnected things. So the more patterns you've got available to you, the more likely you are to make connections.
And the ability to make connections and to make hypotheses that include more information, more experience, more contextual process. It makes a big difference. Okay, it's going to, one of the things that I see is that there's a kind of lock-in that we're in. Of course, all living creatures are in the familiar. They're in the habituated communication, the habituated relationship with an environment, habituated relationships with other organisms, and those habituated relationships are produced essentially through abductive process. So it's not in the organisms, it's in the relationship between them, and how, if the bacteria are not getting enough nutrients, they will move into another relationship with something else, and that will shift the digestive systems of the other organisms, and so on and so forth. So this constant shifting and adjusting is in the abductive process. If you ask yourself, in what way does the earthworm actually describe the tree or describe the meadow? In what way does what we're looking at is that if you try to change the parts, the parts move around to try to complete their relationships as they are habituated to do. So this is why, hold on one sec. This is why the abductive process, to my thinking, is probably working with abductive is probably the most important work that can happen in terms of meeting complexity. But it's not so easy to see. Okay. And this is interesting because all the time we see issues that hop contexts. You've got, a child in school that's really struggling, and it could be diet. It could be economy. It could be a relationship to the peers, or a relationship to the child's body, right? So it's not necessarily the math book. It could be the math book. But what we're looking at here is that the issues are not where they seem like they are. And so when we're working with abductive process, you're in between these places. And it's very often not clear what has changed.
And
when people's abductive process shifts, you don't really know what's shifted.
I think there's a couple of things there. So I agree, the ability to explore a hypothesis. One of the problems I get with people using the Cynefin framework, for example, is very few of them realize it's evolved over 20 years and it's changed a lot, because they're so used to frameworks which are one-time publications based on a series of cases. So Cynefin has evolved through practice and theory, right, as it's gone through. And I think it's this ability to test multiple hypotheses. So, for example, Eva Jablonka's work in epigenetics, which if you haven't read Eva, she's eminently reasonable and brilliant, right? Which actually is about the mechanisms of cultural inheritance and the activation of DNA. Now, just exploring, and particularly a work on the way that symbolic language can actually result in inherited patterns.
Mm-hmm.
The minute you start to read that, you have to completely change the way you think about things. And interestingly, it goes back to Darwin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Darwin said culture must inherit. We just don't know the mechanism. But the neo-Darwinianists, and Dawkins is one of the worst offenders here, are into these very linear models. They want single cause. They want single effect. And I think the ability to hold multiple hypotheses is key. Now, I've said this on a lot, and I'll repeat it. One of the greatest trainings I ever had at school, and we had this from the age of 11 to 18, is every week we had to walk to the front of the class and we were given a card and it gave us a motion and a side. And the first one I ever had was you support capital punishment. And my mother was campaigning actively against it at the time. So I think the teacher was being deliberately provocative. So every week from 7, 8 years, we had to argue for something we didn't believe in on a weekly basis without preparation. Mm-hmm. Now, what that meant is we read everything. And one of the key things that does is it teaches you to make connections, because you have to make a connection with the audience, and you have to make a connection between concepts, and you have to make connections between metaphors, and you have to do it very quickly. And that's a powerful, I think, synthesis. But the ability to hold multiple hypotheses is a real problem now. People don't like doing it, and they don't like being put into that position.
I think it's interesting the way that this question of meaning comes into the middle of this. And I know that when I brought this in, I brought it in with a little bit of cheek. I have felt, and I think that you have also, that there's a way in which, because of the abductive process patterns of language, of hypothesis, of the way other contexts have made sense and what it took to survive in school, in our jobs, in society, that it is very, very difficult to then bring in the ideas, the knowledge, the wisdom of complexity, whether it's complexity science or understanding of living systems coming from ancient peoples since forever. It doesn't sit well. They don't work well together. There is a breakdown. And that breakdown comes at the cost of doing the very thing we're talking about, okay, which is that having spent a lifetime learning how to find the thing I'm looking for and use it to get the recipe, everything becomes a recipe. Everything becomes a methodology in the sense that it becomes a tool to find a solution. And everyone wants a solution, and everyone wants a tool to get to the solution. So therefore, the use of complex thinking must be a tool to get to a solution. And without even a moment's hesitation, unfortunately, the hypothesis process, the abductive process, comes into the work on complexity and decomplexifies it. It gets metabolized into the language usage and the way in which we're used to using things that we learn. And it's an interesting problem, because now what we've got is a sudden, very trendy interest in this language where, And unfortunately, the existing abductive process has literally abducted the concept.
I think it's absconded rather than abducted. But,
okay, I go with you there.
I think, and it's interesting. There's three things we got in common, which are worth noting. One is we both play language games, but not in a Wittgensteinian state. We use language to create new meaning. So we're deliberately introducing ambiguity in language so people will see things differently. You do that with multiple Greek compound nouns, and I do it with Welsh words, yeah, and with words nobody's heard for the last 100 years, which I can give meaning to. So that's significant because, you know, as Heidegger said, man thinks he's the master of language, but language is the master of man. So language has this apparatic effect. It gets people to think differently. I think also both of us are heavily into the use of aesthetics and art. Yeah. Because, and that's the abstraction concept. And I think abstraction is key to abduction, because it is this disconnect from the material. Yeah. But it's not the sort of panpsychism or any of that sort of thing. It's a recognition of the material, but a recognition that the human ability to abstract, to see beauty in things, is actually part of that. And I think the other interesting thing, which is a theory, so right, both of us actually spent part of our lives in communes. I mean, you had a privileged background in West Coast Californian hippies. I was in a deep Christian Marxist commune near Bristol, right?
We got to compare.
Communal living is actually quite interesting because it relieves pressure. And I think we kind of like lost that. I mean, a friend of mine who worked in counterterrorism used to say, you know, every village used to have an idiot and it was okay because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy, right? And I think that, and you know, the work we're doing at the moment on peace and conflict resolution post-election in the States is finally starting to focus on creating human intimacy around issues of common concern, rather than an entirely mediated discussion about areas of difference. And I think, you know, most problems we had in the commune were solved by going out for a walk together, which normally ended up in a pub, which was also part of the process. But yeah, walking together, thinking together, being in a different environment changes the way you think about things, yeah? And not being allowed to distance yourself. There's a wonderful film, which is worth watching, called The Journey, available on Netflix. And it's about the peace and reconciliation process in Northern Ireland, where Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley were actually manipulated by the intelligence service into a car and dumped into a forest without protection. So they had no choice but to talk to each other for several hours. And it's a brilliant movie to understand the change which happens, to the point where afterwards they became the Chuckle Brothers, having been part of, you know, vicious enemies before. So I think, yeah, aesthetics, physicality, language, I mean, those are our three classes of aporia. You know, physical change, aesthetic change, linguistic change. I think that's the way you achieve abduction, to be honest. And it's about those are the only ways you can do it.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing with the warm data work is allowing these conversations to take place where people have to make connections between multiple contexts and do it in conversation. And you just said something really interesting, Dave, which was that this happens through intimate conversation. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that we have been sort of organizing the conditions of the warm data work so that what people are talking about, okay, leaves a space for the connections that are not in what they're talking about.
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things about the conversations Beth and I have been having. We've had this Welsh meet Aboriginal stuff going on, Indigenous. So that's with Tyson. And aside from the fact that the elimination of Welsh happened in the same way at the same time as the elimination of Indigenous languages in Australia. So we've got that in common in terms of the way it happened. But one of the things we've been talking about a lot is the Northern European, North American tendency to believe nothing happens until everybody gets together and agree it will happen. Whereas where I was brought up, and certainly Indigenous tradition, is, well, you go and do things together and then you have the conversations. Yeah? Because grand conversations are not the same as intimate conversations. Now, you do that in warm data in the way that you put people together. We're increasingly doing it in SenseMaker, in the way we're entangling people's narratives with other people's narratives. Right. Which is a virtual form of intimacy. But intimacy is absolutely key, because without intimacy, you have no empathy. Yeah, in the system.
Well, what I find also is that when people are actually in this process, that the stories of their lives hold multiple contextual processes. All of them do, always, all the time, every time. You can't tell a mono context story. It's actually, if it's coming from your real life and it's coming from inside you, it's going to be rich with context and overlap and entanglement. And probably there's a lot of unresolved mess in there that you just are with because it's your life and you live with it. And this is that thing of getting back to the loss of the blur. And when you tell me a story, the story that I hear is not the story that you told. I hear your story through my story, through my experience, and I change your story as it enters me. And what I reply then to your story is then, this other kind of filtration version of a response, which is how you get the possibility for change. It's not like the world of nature and living systems are communicating in perfectly orchestrated contact points of explicitly direct information exchange. The information is moving.
I mean, the Cynefin word, which I use, which we just rebranded the company on, it's the framework. It's people often translate it as the German Heimat, but it's absolutely not that. Heimat, Cynefin is a flow concept. It's this concept you live in multiple channels of meaning, of which you're only partially aware. They may be religious, historical, geographical, whatever. You can never be fully aware of them, but they hugely influence where you are and what direction you're traveling.
Exactly.
And at the moment, Tyson's trying to find some Aboriginal equivalents for me because it's an untranslatable. The English don't have an equivalent. You can't translate it into English except by sort of poetic form. And I think that concept of flow is important. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is one of the key things which a lot of people quote in complexity, but I think they get it wrong in human complex systems, is they use path dependency as an excuse for despair. And one of the things I think human beings have learned to do, and this is what we're trying to do with this concept of entangled timelines, is use empathy to break path dependency. You're not required to follow the path of your own culture if you can see other cultures and other ways of being. And to me, that's one of the important things we're working on peace and conflict side, is how do you break the path dependency of I grew up in the Midwest, I grew up in that issue. And it's not going to happen by just getting people together and telling them they should work differently, because that doesn't work.
Because that's not where the problem is.
It's going to work by them seeing where they have things in common, not being told they have things in common, but finding those for themselves and literally going for walks, whether they're virtual or physical, and having those small conversations as they go.
And I would add to that, Dave, that what I'm seeing is that those sorts of issues also get loosened up from information coming from other contexts, from unthought about directions, which you sort of said in the beginning, that there's this, the meaning at the margin, and that when you get caught in a complex issue, the anxiety to solve the problem is a distraction from the complexity. And so it's very easy not to notice in that moment that there's all kinds of, this is why we say that time heals everything, because as time passes, you're able to see more context and you see the issue that was so hot and in your face. It's a small feature of a larger landscape over time. But when you're in it, you just see this one little thing up in your face. So it's also producing this habituated response to make a direct corrective, to address this with the linear notion and to get a step-by-step answer of how to fix it.
It's interesting. Yeah. One of the things which has been one of the most successful intervention techniques, and it came from looking at brain plasticity and the way village and communities worked, right? So we know we know that the brain sort of ceases plasticity sort of post-puberty as it locks down to meet the needs of society, but then it becomes plastic again when you reach 40s or 50s. Yeah? So if you look at it, innovation in the humanities tends to be older, in the science it's younger. And we think the evolutionary reason is kind of like, you've had 14 years to learn, right? You've now got to go out and hunt for the tribe and assume its prejudices. But you don't see racism before you hit puberty. If you survive into your 40s or 50s, you've obviously got something about you, but you can't lead the tribe anymore. So you have to go into the wisdom business, all right, which is where I'm happily ensconced, all right? And whether I'm wise or not, I don't know, but I'm definitely in the wisdom business. So what we've been doing is using what are called transgenerational pairs, putting young people together with people in their grandparents' generation and acting them as interlocutors, both in terms of problem definition and solution finding, and then linking them with people who actually have the power to do something later. And I think that for us has been very successful in terms of the way it works, and we're starting to expand that. And it's this concept of putting things together in different combinations at scale, which I think is going to be important. And it's like climate change. Until people feel climate change as, and use the word again, as an intimate problem in their own day-to-day lives, they won't be prepared to make the sacrifices needed at a global level. And everybody's focusing on the global problem. Nobody's focusing on the local problem in terms of awareness. Yeah. And I think, that's something, I mean, Anna's working on it for us and others. But it's that ability, I'll come back to a phrase I used earlier, I think, which is small noticings are key.
The small noticings, because the small noticings hold the multi-contextual process. When we get into this level of what I sometimes call aboutness, when you get into that, and now we're going to talk about the education system, there's a loss. And
there's a lovely poem by R.S. Thomas, who's a very fierce Welsh Anglo poet, which basically talks about the light on a field and the thing he didn't notice until he passed by and realized he should go back again. And I think that concept is really important. It's the sideways glance, the peripheral vision, the ability to connect with something unusual.
So one of the things about meaning losing its meaning is that there's a question in there of which meaning are you looking for? What kind of meaning are you seeking? And I think that's it's taking the thingness out of meaning, right? Of looking at it through this abductive process. What it is that's happening is that meaning is always changing. Meaning is disagreeing with itself. Meaning is moving. And when we are looking for a life with meaning, I guess for me, that one of the things that's so important about that is the ability to recognize, and like you said in that poem, that what I thought was meaningful before is not what I feel is meaningful now.
And this also picks up, I think, on one of the questions in the chat. And it's something you and I have talked about before and intended to do a webinar on, which is the danger of mediation. So we talk about one of the characteristics of managing a complex system is disintermediation. And one of the really valuable things, and I've forgotten the name of the book, but it's the one I'm reading at the moment. I know you like it as well. It's a retelling of history.
Oh, The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah. So apart from the fact it's 10 times as long as it needs to be, and I wish you'd get to the point, but it's a brilliant book, right? And I think the point is, get where I was coming from on this. Yeah. I should not look at the chat. You should not have opened the chat because it's coming in all the time now.
I know.
What you look at in that book is this fundamental concept that the minute we introduce money as a means of exchange, people were disintermediated from what went on. And to me, that's the problem with the blockchain. It's just substituting one form of mediation from another. And the thing we're talking about with Tyson, which I think is really important, is this concept of a gift. Because a gift is not an exchange, and you don't put things into the favor bank. I kept having that argument with Larry Prusak. He saw everything. I do a favor for you so I can call a favor down later. And I said, that's not what gifting is about. Gifting is an indication you want to be a member of a community. It's a ritual. Yeah. And the community has a response back. And I think the trouble is you've got a sort of techno-fetishist school of thinking. I mean, I was arguing this on a big call yesterday. You know, the West Coast think the solution to all problems is technology, and it isn't. Yeah, technology is a part of this, but we need human intimacy and proximity. And we need to remove the interpretive layers between people and their environment and people as far as possible. Because the more in mediation you have, the more impersonal you get in the process.
Well, also, I think it's a kind of tyranny of professionalism that is producing the tonality and the mono-contextual possibilities of discussion that actually don't include, we've been taught, you know, don't bring your personal life to work.
Yeah.
Or
can you not do that? And why shouldn't you?
Yeah, it's insane. Yeah. And so I think, you know, for me, what is important here is this. Well, I've been working on this new theory that I call aphanipoesis. Aphani means unseen and poesis to become, of how things are actually, how things are produced in unseen ways. There's coalescing taking place that's unseen, and it must be unseen. And in the worst case scenarios, it looks like insidiousness. It looks like sexism and racism and those things. You can't just walk up to someone and say, have respect for each other, because they have these deeply embedded unseen processes taking place. And abduction is right at the core of that things they learned in one context, they attached into another context, they attached into another without knowing they were doing it, without paying attention to it. Lifelong collections of coalescing.
And I come back
but
to
it's also how vitality is created. It's also how evolution happens.
Yeah, and I come back to the St. Paul quote that, you know, see as through a glass darkly, right? If you make things visible too quickly, they get destroyed.
Yeah. They get sucked back into the existing process.
It's the Borg. They get absorbed, right?
Yeah.
So this is the form we'll make it fit. And I mean, I created a whole model around this called Fletcher's curves. There's a point where you have to keep things hidden, and there's a point where you must make them very visible very quickly. And I think we don't always have that ability. I mean, part of what we do now is actually to make something visible, which has sort of been hidden, right? And I think it's this intertwining, this entanglement of the unseen and the seen, the visible, the physical, the mental, all of these sort of things, yeah, that we become unaccustomed to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Lutheran theologian, and for a Catholic to quote a Lutheran means I must regard it as significant. Otto had this concept of the numinous, which we've got a program running on. And the idea of the numinous is that there is a sense of another, that there's a sense of something other than the atomistic individual. And I think that's one of the things we're starting to lose, and we've got to find ways to recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this, and go back to Aristotle again, it's the Aristotelian concept of virtue ethics. If people are virtuous, they will do the right thing, but you can't govern it by rules. Yeah,
that's right. And that's the point, is that the premises must change.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we keep coming back to, is that you can keep changing the rules all you want. You can change the parts, but if the relationships and the premises of those relationships remain the same, you're just going to get a repeat, not to mention plus XXL consequences. So here we are, and we're at time. And I wanted to read a poem, and I brought three, but one is one that I wrote, but one is about meaning. So which one should I give you?
Go for meaning.
Okay. All right. So this piece is this piece called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. But I think it actually fits into our whole conversation. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin by beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
I think on that point we should finish.
I think so too. Hey, thanks, Dave. This was fun.
Ellie, it's back with you.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so, so much to all of you who came here today, to Dave and to Nora, for everyone who shared comments and questions. It really has been really spectacular to be a part of this. So thank you, everyone. As we've shared in the chat, we will be following up with an email as soon as we can with the recording and some other bits and pieces, including probably quite a hefty bibliography now, following on the conversation. So yeah, just a huge thank you from all of us, and we hope to see you in the future conversations as they unravel. Thank you very much and good night.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, everybody who helped organize this.
Ellie, you're capturing the questions so we don't lose them in the comments.
Yeah, don't you worry.
Sorry to double check. Right? Mea culpa, mea culpa.
Great to be with you.
Thank you, everyone.